Welcome to Show Hell. I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep. So before you get too warm, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there now. Relax, take a deep breath, and let yourself unwind. The GPS had led them wrong. Rachel pressed her face against the passenger window, watching the pine trees blur past in the dying light. Are you sure this is right? The photo showed a lake. Behind the wheel, David squinted at the gravel road ahead. 3 hours of driving through increasingly desolate Florida backwoods. And now this, a narrow track that barely qualified as a road, cutting through palmetto scrub and moss-draped oaks that hadn't seen civilization in decades. The host said it was secluded, David said, though his voice carried doubt. Maybe we missed a turn. Rachel checked her phone. No signal, of course. She'd wanted to get away from everything for their anniversary weekend. But this felt less like escape and more like being swallowed whole. The headlights swept across a wooden sign, weathered and leaning. Private property. Below it, smaller letters, hunting preserve. David, I see it. He slowed the car. Maybe it's multi-use. You know, hunting in season, rentals off season. The road curved and suddenly there it was. A low-slung lodge of dark wood and stone. Windows glowing amber in the twilight. It looked nothing like the cozy cabin from the Airbnb photos, but it was shelter, and they were tired. David parked beside a stack of cordwood. The silence when he cut the engine was absolute. No traffic, no neighbors, just the whisper of wind through Spanish moss. Keys supposed to be under the planter, Rachel said, checking the messages on her phone from 3 hours ago. The last time they'd had service. They found the planter, a large ceramic pot beside the front door filled with dead geraniums. David lifted it, felt around underneath. Nothing. Maybe it fell, Rachel suggested. But even as she knelt to search the wooden porch, she felt the first flutter of unease. The door was massive, made of what looked like reclaimed barnwood with iron hardware that belonged to another century, a far cry from the cheerful yellow door in the rental photos. David tried the handle. The door swung open. Well, he said after a moment, I guess that works. The interior was pristine, too pristine. Polished hardwood floors reflected the light from overhead fixtures made of antler. Leather furniture arranged around a stone fireplace big enough to roast a pig. The walls were lined with mounted deer heads, their glass eyes catching the light. Jesus, Rachel whispered, this isn't the place. But David was already hauling in their bags. Look, we're here. It's getting dark, and we got nowhere else to go. The host probably just forgot to lock up. We'll sort it out in the morning. Rachel wanted to argue, but exhaustion weighed heavier than caution. The drive had been brutal, and the thought of another 3 hours in the car made her stomach clench. Besides, the place was immaculate. Whoever owned it clearly took care of the property. She wandered through the main room while David brought in the cooler. More hunting trophies decorated the walls. Not just deer, but wild boar with yellow tusks, a black bear rearing on its hind legs, and something that might have been a panther. The furniture was expensive, the kind of stuff you'd find in an upscale hunting lodge, catering to wealthy sportsmen. The kitchen adjoined the main room, separated by a breakfast bar made from a single slab of polished wood. Industrial-grade appliances, professional quality knives mounted on magnetic strips, a wine cooler stocked with bottles that probably cost more than her car payment. Holy crap, David called from the kitchen. Look at this. He'd opened the massive side-by-side refrigerator. The shelves were mostly empty, except for a few bottles of craft beer and some expensive-looking steaks still in butcher paper. "And check out the freezer," he said, opening the bottom drawer. The freezer was nearly full. Vacuum-sealed packages of meat labeled and dated venison mostly, but other things too. Wild turkey, something labeled wild boar chops, and in the back, a package that made Rachel's breath catch. The plastic was stained dark red, not the clean, processed look of the other packages, but messy, raw, and the label written in black marker was just 2 words: "Fresh kill." "David, I see it." His voice had gone flat. Probably just, a hunter's humor. But Rachel was backing away from the refrigerator, her skin crawling. The package was recent, yesterday's date, and there was something about the shape inside the plastic that didn't look like any game animal she'd ever seen. A sound from the back of the lodge made them both freeze. A soft thump, like something being set down carefully. "Wind," David said quickly. "Just the wind." But the lodge was solid, built to withstand hurricanes, and there was no wind tonight. The Spanish moss outside hung motionless in the still air. The sound came again. Footsteps. Rachel grabbed David's arm. "We need to leave now." "Rachel, come on. You're freaking out over nothing." "Nothing?" She gestured at the freezer. "You call that nothing?" Before David could answer, they heard a phone ring. Not the electronic trill of a cell phone, but the mechanical bell of an old landline. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the lodge. David moved toward the sound, but Rachel caught his sleeve. "Don't. What if it's the owner? Maybe they're trying to reach us, wondering where we are." The phone kept ringing. 7 rings, 8, then silence. In the quiet that followed, Rachel became aware of other details she'd missed. The smell, for instance. Not just wood polish and leather, but something underneath, something organic and sharp that made her think of the butcher shop where her grandmother used to take her as a child, and the hunting trophies. Now that she looked closer, some of them were wrong. The wild boar's tusks were too long, curved back toward the skull in a way that would have made eating impossible. The deer's antlers showed signs of having been artificially enhanced, wired and glued into impossible configurations. "David," she said slowly, "look at the bear." The black bear dominated one wall, rearing up on its hind legs in a classic hunting lodge pose. But its front paws weren't paws at all. They were hands, human hands, preserved and mounted where the bear's claw should have been. David followed her gaze. For a moment, his face went through a series of micro-expressions. Confusion, denial, dawning horror. She watched him try to find a rational explanation. Watched him fail. Watched the careful compartments in his mind collapse as he understood what they were really looking at. When he spoke, his voice was different. Flat, military. "We're leaving now." But as they turned toward the door, headlights swept across the windows. A vehicle was coming up to drive, moving fast enough to throw gravel against the undercarriage. Rachel and David looked at each other, the weight of their situation settling like a stone in deep water. They were miles from anywhere, in a place they shouldn't be, with no cell service and nowhere to run. The headlights died. Car door slammed. "Back door," David whispered. But even as he said it, they heard more vehicles arriving. The sound of engines and slamming doors surrounded the lodge. Voices drifted through the walls. Male voices laughing and talking in the easy camaraderie of old friends meeting for a familiar ritual. Traffic was murder. Better be worth it this time. Not like that disaster in March. New rules, boys. Clean kills only. No mess to clean up. After Rachel's blood turned to ice water, she grabbed David's hand and pulled him toward the hallway that led deeper into the lodge, away from the main room and the voices growing louder. The hallway was lined with more trophies, but these were different. Smaller, more personal. Jewelry mounted in shadow boxes. A child's shoe, bronzed and displayed like a hunting prize. A woman's purse, expensive leather, now cracked with age, positioned behind glass like a museum piece. At the end of the hall, Rachel found a bedroom and pulled David inside. The room was spartanly furnished. A king-size bed, a dresser, a single window that looked out onto Black Forest. She moved to the window and peered through the curtains. 5 vehicles were parked in the clearing around the lodge. Expensive SUVs and pickup trucks, the kind of rides that cost more than most people made in a year. Men were unloading gear from the backs, duffel bags, rifle cases, what looked like military surplus equipment. How many? David whispered. I count 8, maybe 9. Rachel let the curtain fall. David, what the hell have we walked into? Before he could answer, the front door opened. Boots on hardwood. Voices filling the main room. Lights were on when we got here. Somebody's been through the fridge. Car out front. Looks like our rabbits are already here. Rabbits. Rachel felt sick. Gentlemen, a new voice said, and this one carried authority. Older, maybe with the kind of gravitas that came from being in charge of dangerous men. It seems we have an early start this weekend. Our guests have already made themselves at home. Laughter rippled through the group, but it wasn't the kind of laughter you heard at parties. It was the sound predators made when they caught scent of prey. Same rules as always. The authoritative voice continued. Clean kills. No evidence, no loose ends. Winner takes the pot, and we all go home with our reputations intact. What about the timeline? Another voice asked. Dawn to dawn, 24 hours. They got a head start, but they don't know the terrain. A pause, and they sure as hell don't know what they're up against. Rachel looked at David and saw her own terror reflected in his eyes. Whatever this was, whatever sick game these men played, she and David had stumbled into it by accident. They weren't supposed to be here, weren't part of whatever arrangement normally brought victims to this place. But the men outside didn't know that. To them, Rachel and David were just another couple of rabbits ready to be hunted. Motion sensors. Someone was saying I've got them placed at all the usual exit points. Cameras are live. Night vision. Full kit. Thermal imaging. The works. Remember, boys, clean kills only. The judge doesn't want another mess like last time. The judge. Rachel felt something cold crawl up her spine. These weren't just random psychopaths. They were organized, connected. The kind of people who could make problems disappear. David was moving toward the bedroom door, but Rachel caught his arm. Through the thin walls, they could hear the men settling in, unpacking equipment, discussing strategy like it was a corporate retreat. Bedroom window looks like the most likely exit. I'll take the north approach. Remember, they're amateurs, probably panicking right now. David pressed his ear to the door and then turned back to Rachel. They're splitting up, he whispered, getting ready to hunt. Rachel's mind raced. The window was their only option, but they'd heard the men discussing motion sensors, and even if they made it outside, they were in unfamiliar territory, miles from help, but no way to call for assistance. But staying wasn't an option either. She moved to the dresser and started pulling out drawers as quietly as she could. In the bottom drawer, under some folded clothes, her fingers found something unexpected, a small leather journal. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with handwriting entries dated over the past several months. The first few pages looked like hunting logs, but as she read further, her blood went cold. March 15th, couple from Miami. Male put up good fight, lasted till almost dawn. Female tried to hide in the old oak. Williams took them both with head shot. Clean, no complications. April 22nd, solo target, male, early 30s. Thought he could swim the creek. Morrison got him at the far bank. Buried the remains in the usual spot. May 18th, 2 females, friends from college. Made it interesting by separating them first. Peterson and Kane each took one. Good sport all around. The entries went on page after page documenting what could only be described as a hunting preserve for human beings. Rich men who paid to hunt the most dangerous game of all. And now she and David were next. David, she whispered, showing him the journal. His face went white as he read. When he looked up, his expression had changed. The confusion and fear were still there, but underneath was something harder, something that reminded Rachel why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. The quiet strength that had carried him through the combat tours in Afghanistan. "How many weapons did you see?" he asked quietly. "Rifles, handguns, military gear." "Numbers 8, maybe 9 of them. 2 of us." David nodded, his mind already working through tactical problems. They expect amateurs. Scare rabbits running blind through the woods. "We are scared rabbits." "No." His voice was firm. "We're not. I didn't survive 3 tours in Kandahar to get picked off by a bunch of rich psychopaths playing weekend warrior." Rachel felt a flutter of hope. David was many things: gentle, thoughtful, sometimes too trusty. But he was also a Marine, and right now she needed the Marine more than the gentle soul she'd married. "What do we do?" "First, we get out of this room without them knowing. Then we turn the tables. David, they have night vision motion sensors. They have equipment," he corrected, "but they're not soldiers. They're hunters used to stalking prey that runs away." His smile was grim. They've never hunted prey that fights back. Outside, the voices were moving, spreading out through the lodge and the surrounding property. Rachel heard the back door open and close, the soft crackle of radio communication. David moved to the window and studied the forest beyond. "They'll expect us to run for the road or try to circle back to the car. Instead, we go deeper into the woods, find their base camp, their equipment cache." "Base camp. These guys are organized. They'll have a command post somewhere, probably equipped with all their surveillance gear. We take that out. We level the playing field." Rachel stared at him. "You want to attack them?" "I want to survive." David's voice was steady, but his eyes were hard as flint. "And right now, the best defense is a good offense." A sound from the hallway made them both freeze. The soft whisper of a footstep on carpet. Someone was moving through the lodge, checking rooms. David pressed his finger to his lips, then moved to the bedroom door. The footsteps were closer now, just outside. Rachel held her breath as the doorknob turned slowly. The door opened to reveal a man in military style, clothing carrying what looked like an assault rifle. He was older, maybe 50, with the kind of precise movements that spoke of professional training. His eyes swept the room methodically, taking in every detail. For a moment, he didn't see them. David had positioned them behind the opening door, using the furniture as concealment. But then the man stepped fully into the room, and his gaze found Rachel crouched behind the dresser. His rifle started to come up, and David moved. The Marine training took over. David's hand closed over the rifle barrel, pushing it aside as the man tried to bring it to bear. They went down together, hitting the floor hard enough to shake the furniture. The rifle went skittering across the hardwood as David got on top, his hands finding the man's throat. But the hunter was stronger than he looked and experienced in close combat. He got his knee up, drove it into David's ribs, and rolled them both over. They fought in grim silence, each knowing that noise would bring the others running. The hunter was good, trained, disciplined. But David had been fighting for his life in foreign countries for years. When the hunter reached for a knife on his belt, David caught his wrist and twisted until something snapped. The hunter's mouth opened in a silent scream, and David used the moment to get his arm around the man's throat, applying pressure to the carotid artery. It took 30 seconds for the hunter to go limp. David held the choke for another 10 seconds, then let go. The man slumped to the floor, unconscious, but breathing. "Is he?" Rachel whispered. "Alive for now." David was already stripping the man of his equipment: radio, night vision goggles, ammunition. He paused, looking at the unconscious hunter, then grabbed a lamp cord and quickly bound the man's hands and feet. But we don't have long before they miss him. The radio crackled to life. "Davis, report. What's your 20? David looked at Rachel, then keyed the microphone. "Position secure," he said in a low voice that might pass for the unconscious hunter. "No contact." "Copy that. Continue. Sweep." David clipped the radio to his belt and handed Rachel the night vision goggles. "Put these on. We're going dark." He found the rifle, a high-end AR-15 variant with tactical modifications, and checked the magazine. 30 rounds. Not much against 8 or 9 men, but better than nothing. "David," Rachel said, adjusting the unfamiliar goggles. "I can't do this. I'm not a soldier. You don't have to be a soldier. You just have to survive." He moved to the window, studying the forest beyond. "Remember what I taught you about moving quietly?" She nodded. David had insisted on teaching her basic fieldcraft when they'd started camping together, back when survival was just a game between lovers. "Good. We stick together, move slow, and think like predators instead of prey." He opened the window carefully, testing for squeaks. It moved silently on well-oiled hinges. "Ready?" Rachel wanted to say no, wanted to curl up in the corner and wait for dawn, wait for this nightmare to end. But she looked at David, really looked at him, and saw the calm competence that had carried him through war zones. If anyone could get them out of this alive, it was him. "Ready," she said. They went through the window, feet first. David first, then Rachel. The night vision goggles turned the forest into a green-tinted alien landscape, full of shadows and false movement. But they could see, which was more than their hunters would expect. David led them away from the lodge, not toward the road, but deeper into the pine woods. Behind them, the lights of the lodge grew smaller, but Rachel could still hear voices, the occasional crackle of radio communication. They moved slowly, carefully, using the techniques David had learned in the military, heel to toe, testing each step before committing their weight, avoiding branches that might snap or leaves that might rustle. It was exhausting work, requiring total concentration. but it was better than the helpless terror she'd felt in the lodge. After 20 minutes of careful movement, David held up his hand and they stopped. Through the trees ahead, Rachel could see lights, not the warm glow of the lodge, but the harsh white illumination of work lights. "Base camp," David whispered. They crept closer, staying low and using the trees for cover. The hunters had set up their command post in a small clearing, complete with folding tables covered in electronic equipment, laptops showing what looked like surveillance feeds, radio equipment, even a portable generator to power it all. And there were only 2 men guarding it. Rachel counted again to be sure. 2 guards, both armed but relaxed. They were drinking coffee from thermos bottles and talking in low voices about the hunt, confident in their technological superiority. David studied the setup for several minutes, memorizing the layout, the positions of the guards, the placement of the equipment. Then he touched Rachel's shoulder, and they withdrew deeper into the trees. "Here's what we're going to do," he whispered. "You're going to create a distraction. Nothing dramatic, just enough to draw their attention for 30 seconds. What kind of distraction? Break a branch. Make some noise about 50 yards that way." He pointed into the forest. "Make it sound like someone blundering through the woods, trying to be quiet, but failing. And while they're investigating, I take them out and destroy their equipment." David's voice was grim. "Rachel, I need you to understand something. These men were planning to hunt us for sport. They were going to kill us and add our names to their little journal. I'm not going to show them any mercy." Rachel looked into his eyes and saw a stranger. Not the gentleman she'd married, but the Marine who'd fought in places where mercy was a luxury that got people killed. "I understand," she said, and she did. This wasn't about justice or morality anymore. This was about survival. And in a survival situation, the rules were different. David checked his rifle one more time, then melted into the forest like a ghost. Rachel waited until she couldn't see him anymore, then began moving toward her assigned position. The night vision goggles made navigation easier, but they also flattened her depth perception, making every shadow potentially dangerous. When she judged she was far enough from the command post, she found a dead branch and broke it deliberately, letting it crack loudly in the still air. The effect was immediate. The radio chatter from the camp stopped, and she heard urgent whispers through the trees. She could see flashlight beams sweeping the forest. "Check it out," one of the guards said. "Probably our rabbits trying to circle back." "I've got it," the other replied. Footsteps moved through the underbrush, heading directly toward Rachel's position. She stayed frozen behind a large pine tree, trusting in David's plan and her own stillness. The guard passed within 10 feet of her hiding spot, following the sound she'd made. His flashlight beam swept back and forth, but never quite found her. And then from the direction of the command post came a sound that made her blood freeze. A short, sharp cry quickly cut off. The guard with the flashlight spun around. "Mitchell! Mitchell, you okay?" No answer from the camp. The guard was already moving back, rifle ready, when the second cry came. This one was different, a gurgling sound that spoke of terrible damage to the throat. Rachel pressed herself against the tree trunk and tried not to think about what David was doing 50 yards away. She'd known intellectually that he'd killed people in the war, but knowing and witnessing were different things entirely. The forest went quiet again. No radio chatter, no voices, just the whisper of wind through the pines. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. David's voice came through the darkness. "Rachel, it's done." She found him in the command post clearing, systematically destroying the electronic equipment. The laptops were smashed, the radio gear reduced to twisted metal and scattered components. The portable generator was silent, its fuel line cut. The two guards were nowhere to be seen. "Where?" She began. "Don't ask," David said quietly. "Just help me with this." They worked together to complete the destruction of the Hunter's technological advantage. When they were finished, the command post looked like a bomb had gone off. "Now what?" Rachel asked. David consulted the night vision scope he'd taken from one of the guards. "Now even the odds some more." According to their radio chatter, they've split into teams of 2 or 3. We take them one team at a time. "David, there are still 6 or 7 of them out there. 6 or 7 rich guys playing soldier," he corrected. "They might have good equipment, but they don't have discipline. They don't have real training, and they sure as hell don't have motivation like ours." He was right. Rachel realized the Hunters were playing a game, enjoying themselves. For David and her, this was life or death. The radio on David's belt crackled. "Base camp, do you copy?" "Base camp, respond." David smiled grimly and keyed the microphone. "Base camp, here all quiet." "Jesus, Davis, where the hell have you been? We've been trying to raise you for 20 minutes. Equipment malfunction." David replied in the same low voice he'd used before. "Just got it sorted." "Well, get your ass in gear. We got movement on the south perimeter. Looks like our rabbits are making a run for the road." "Copy that. Moving to intercept." David clipped the radio back to his belt and looked at Rachel. "South perimeter. That means they're concentrating their people in the wrong area. So we go north. We go hunting." David corrected. They moved through the forest like wolves, using the Hunter's own radio communications to track their movements. The night vision equipment gave them a crucial advantage. They could see their enemies long before being seen. The first team they encountered was positioned along what the Hunters thought was an escape route. 2 men with expensive rifles and cheaper tactics, smoking cigarettes and talking in normal voices while they waited for their prey to stumble into their ambush. David approached them from behind, moving with the silent precision he'd learned in places where noise meant death. Rachel watched from concealment as he dealt with them quickly and efficiently, using techniques she didn't want to think about too closely. When it was over, David stripped them of ammunition and destroyed their radio equipment. Their count was down to 4 or 5 remaining Hunters. The next team, more challenging. David had positioned them near what looked like another ambush point when the radio crackled with a different voice, younger, more professional. "Peterson here, moving to grid 7. No visual on targets yet." Through her night vision goggles, Rachel saw David tense. Something about the voice, or maybe the way the Hunter moved through the forest, had caught his attention. "Military," David whispered into her ear. "Real military." The Hunter called Peterson, moved like David did, efficiently, quietly, with the kind of spatial awareness that came from combat experience. When David tried to approach from behind, Peterson spun around as if he'd sensed the movement. The 2 men went down in a tangle of limbs, fighting with lethal precision in near silence. Peterson was good, maybe special forces, Rachel thought, and for a terrifying moment, it looked like David might lose. Peterson got on top, his hands finding David's throat. Rachel saw David's eyes bulge. saw him weakening, and without thinking, she grabbed a fallen branch and brought it down on Peterson's head. The impact sent Peterson rolling sideways, giving David the opening he needed. The fight ended 30 seconds later, but David was breathing hard, blood trickling from a split lip. Close, he admitted, checking his rifle for damage. Too close. They'd made noise. Not much, but enough. In the distance, Rachel heard voices calling Peterson's name. "We need to move," David said. "Now, how do you feel?" David asked as they moved to their next objective. Rachel considered the question seriously. She should feel sick, traumatized by the violence she'd witnessed. Instead, she felt oddly calm, focused. These men had planned to hunt her like an animal, to kill her for sport, and add her name to their sick tally. Whatever David was doing to them, they deserved it. "I feel like I want to go home," she said finally. "We will," David promised. "But first we finish this." The radio chatter was becoming more frantic as the hunters realized something was wrong. Men weren't checking in, equipment was malfunctioning, and their carefully planned hunt was turning into a disaster. "Can't raise the base camp. Davis isn't responding. Something's wrong. We need to regroup." But regrouping was exactly what David didn't want them to do. He led Rachel on a careful hunt through the forest, using the hunters' radio communications to stay one step ahead of them. One by one, he eliminated the remaining teams, always striking from concealment, always leaving their radio equipment destroyed. By the time the sun began to rise over the Florida pine woods, only 2 hunters remained. The leader, the one with the authoritative voice, who talked about judges and clean kills, and one other man whose radio had gone silent when they had found Peterson's body. David found the leader at the lodge, frantically trying to raise his missing men on a backup radio. The bound and gagged form of Davis, the first hunter they'd encountered, lay zip-tied in the corner of the main room, discovered too late to help his companions. The man was older, maybe 60, with the kind of silver hair and expensive clothes that spoke of serious money. He looked like he belonged on a yacht or a golf course, not in a hunting lodge surrounded by evidence of his sick hobby. "And of the line," David said, stepping out of the forest with his rifle trained on the man. The hunter spun around, his hand moving toward a pistol on his hip, but he froze when he saw David's eyes. "You," the hunter said, and his voice held a note of genuine surprise. "You're supposed to be prey." "Plans change," David replied. Rachel emerged from the tree-in, still wearing the night vision goggles pushed up on her forehead. She looked like a warrior returning from battle, and maybe that's what she was. "Who are you people?" the hunter demanded. "This isn't how it works. You don't know the rules." "We learned them fast enough," David said. "Clean kills, no evidence, no loose ends. Isn't that right?" The hunter's face went pale as he realized what David was suggesting. "Look, we can work something out," the man said quickly. "The money, I can pay you more than you've ever seen. Like you paid the couples from Miami, the college girls." Rachel's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath. How much did they get paid? The hunter looked between them, perhaps finally understanding that he was no longer the predator in this situation. "You can't just kill me," he said desperately. "I'm a federal judge. People will look for me." "A federal judge," David repeated. "That's even better. Think how many lives we'll save." The hunter opened his mouth to say something else, but David's rifle barked once, and the man crumpled to the porch of his sick playground. Rachel stared at the body for a long moment, then looked at David. "Is it over?" "It's over," he confirmed. They spent the next hour going through the lodge systematically, gathering evidence of the hunting preserve's activities. The journal Rachel had found was just the tip of the iceberg. There were photographs, financial records, computer hard drives, and memory cards containing video footage of previous hunts. "We have to take this to the FBI," Rachel said, holding up a folder marked guest registry that contained names, photos, and what looked like payment records. "David, look at this. There are dozens of victims, families who never knew what happened to their loved ones." David was copying files from a laptop onto a portable drive they'd found. "Do you recognize any of these faces?" He showed her a photograph of the federal judge shaking hands with men and expensive suits. Behind them, mounted on the wall like trophies, were driver's licenses. Rachel looked closer. One of the men looked familiar. She'd seen him on the news, talking about judicial reform. Another wore what looked like a sheriff's department uniform. "They are the police, Rachel," David said quietly, ejecting the memory cards from the several cameras. "Look at the guest list. Federal judges, state prosecutors, county sheriffs. How deep do you think this goes? How many investigations would get buried before they even started?" Rachel stared at the evidence in her hands. Proof of dozens of murders, of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement and the justice system. The weight of it made her feel sick. "So what do we do?" she asked. "Just let them get away with it." David was already gathering the most damning evidence. The photographs, the financial records, the hard drives, and memory cards. "We make sure this never happens again, but we do it our way. And the evidence, we keep digital copies, insurance, but the original crime scene burns." Instead, they loaded the evidence into their car along with anything valuable they could carry. The hunting preserve had been financed by wealthy men who could afford to lose a few hundred. Before they left, David used gasoline from the hunters' vehicles to douse the lodge. The fire would destroy any evidence they'd missed, and with any luck, it would look like the work of the missing hunters, men who'd gotten careless and paid the price. They drove out of the forest as the lodge burned behind them, the smoke visible for miles in the clear morning air. "Where do we go now?" Rachel asked. "Home," David said simply. "We go home and try to forget this ever happened." But Rachel knew they'd never really forget. The memory of those nights would stay with them forever. The fear, the violence, the terrible clarity that came with fighting for their lives. Some experiences changed you, marked you in ways that couldn't be undone. They'd gone into the woods as ordinary people on a weekend getaway. They were coming out as something else entirely, survivors. And perhaps that was the most frightening thing of all. Not what they'd endured, but what they'd become in the process of enduring it. The line between civilization and savagery was thinner than most people wanted to believe. Sometimes it took a weekend in hell to learn that lesson. Rachel settled back in the passenger seat and watched the Florida countryside roll past. Somewhere behind them, the hunting lodge was burning, taking its secrets to ash and memory. She reached over and took David's hand, feeling the calluses on his fingers, the new scars from their fight for survival. "I love you," she said. "I love you too," he replied, and his voice was steady. Despite everything they'd been through, they drove toward home, toward their ordinary lives, carrying extraordinary secrets. The GPS worked perfectly now, guiding them back to the world of traffic lights and coffee shops and normal people who would never understand what they'd seen in the Florida woods. Behind them, the smoke continued to rise, a black column against the perfect blue sky, evidence of a game that had finally been won by the prey. The following story: the knife felt good in my hand, balance precise, the kind of tool that could solve problems if you knew how to use it properly. I'd been using it to julienne carrots for my signature Vietnamese fusion tacos, but now I was thinking about other applications, other uses for sharp things when people backed you into corners with no way out. Let me back up. Let me tell you how a girl from Akron, Ohio, went from flipping burgers at Wendy's to running the most successful food truck in downtown Cleveland, and how that success became the thing that might literally kill me, because success, I've learned, is just another word for having something other people want to take away. My name is Veronica Costellos, though everyone calls me V, and 3 months ago, I thought I was living the American dream. Now, I know the American dream is actually a nightmare dressed up in food porn and small business loans. And the monsters under the bed are real. They just wear better suits than you'd expect. It started with desperation, which is where all the best and worst decisions begin. I'd been working double shifts at a diner on East 4th Street, watching hipsters Instagram their overpriced avocado toast while I scraped by on tips and the occasional free meal that management pretended not to notice me taking. 28 years old, culinary degree from a community college I was still paying for, living in a studio apartment that smelled like someone else's sadness. The kind of life that looks pathetic from the outside and feels even worse from the inside. Then Rico disappeared. Rico was my line cook, my friend, and the only person who understood that my Vietnamese grandmother's recipes could transform ordinary street food into something transcendent. We'd been planning to start our own place. Nothing fancy, just a food truck where we could serve real food to real people without some corporate chain breathing down our necks about portion control and profit margins. One Tuesday in February, Rico didn't show up for work, didn't call, didn't text, didn't exist anymore as far as the world was concerned. His landlord said he'd cleared out his apartment in the middle of the night or left 3 months' rent on the kitchen counter in cash and vanished like smoke. The police weren't interested in a missing person case involving a guy with a record for possession and a tendency to disappear when life got complicated. But I knew Rico. He wouldn't just leave. Not when we were so close to making our dream happen. Something had happened to him. Something that made him run, or made him unable to run ever again. The not knowing was eating me alive. A slow acid burn in my chest that got worse every day. That's when the envelope appeared. I found it slipped under my apartment door on a Thursday morning, my name written across the front in careful block letters. Inside, a cashier's check for $50,000 and a business card with nothing but a phone number, no signature, no explanation, just money, and an invitation to ask questions I probably didn't want answered. I stared at that check for an hour, turning it over in my hands like it might reveal its secrets through texture alone. $50,000. Enough to buy a used food truck, get the permits, stock inventory, cover operating expenses for the first few months. Enough to make the dream real, even without Rico. I should have torn it up, should have thrown it away, and kept scraping by on diner wages and illusions of grandeur. But poverty has a way of eroding your moral boundaries. And I'd been poor for so long that I could feel myself disappearing a little more each day. The check was a lifeline, even if I couldn't see what was attached to the other end. I called the number. You found the envelope. The voice was male, middle-aged, with the kind of careful diction that suggested either education or practice at hiding regional accents. I assume you're interested in our proposal. What proposal? You just send me money and a phone number. The money is an investment in your future. Miss Castellanos, your culinary talents are wasted in that diner. We'd like to help you realize your potential. The way he said my name made my skin crawl like he'd been practicing it. Who's we? What do you want in return? Simple terms. Use the money to start your food truck, operate your business. Send us 20% of your gross receipts every week, cash only, to a location we'll provide. No questions, no contact, no complications. That's it. 20%. That's it. Consider us silent partners in your success. I should have asked more questions. Should have demanded to know who he was, why he was interested in me, what happened to Rico. But the check in my hand felt like salvation, and I'd been drowning for so long that I wasn't inclined to examine the life preserver too closely. How do I know this is legitimate? A pause. Then you don't. But you'll cash the check anyway, because you're desperate. And desperate people don't have the luxury of suspicious minds. We'll be in touch, with details. The line went dead. He was right, of course. I cashed the check the next morning, and it cleared without incident. Within 2 weeks, I bought a renovated Airstream trailer, painted it bright yellow with Ban Boulevard and bold red letters across the side. Within a month, I was serving Vietnamese fusion to downtown office workers, and the line stretched around the block. The food was extraordinary. I knew it was. Could taste the alchemy that happened when my grandmother's recipes met American ingredients in my own desperate creativity. The banh mi were perfect symphonies of flavor and texture, the pho rich enough to make people weep, the fusion tacos that married Vietnamese herbs with local Ohio produce unlike anything Cleveland had ever tasted. But it wasn't just the food that made us successful. I had a gift for reading people, for understanding exactly what they needed and serving it up with a smile and just enough attitude to make them feel like they discovered something special. Business people loved the quick service and complex flavors. Food bloggers loved the authenticity mixed with innovation. Social media loved the photogenic plating, and my carefully curated origin story about the granddaughter of Vietnamese immigrants making it in America through hard work and delicious food. The regular customers who'd made us profitable were mostly a joy to serve. Mrs. Patterson from the insurance office who ordered the same vermicelli bowl every Tuesday and always asked about my grandmother. Jake from the construction crew who'd started bringing his whole team for lunch and tipped in cash because he knew how hard small business owners worked. Almost all of them brought warmth to my days except for one man who'd started showing up in week 4. He claimed to be a freelance food writer working on a piece about Cleveland's emerging food scene, but something about him felt off. He asked more questions about my suppliers and my business model than my recipes. His eyes always a little too sharp, a little too focused on details that had nothing to do with the food. When I served him his usual pork banh mi, always the same order, always at exactly 12:30. I caught him watching me with the intensity of someone taking inventory rather than enjoying lunch. Within 6 weeks, we were the most talked about food truck in Cleveland. Within 8 weeks, we were booking private events and catering gigs. Within 10 weeks, I was making more money than I'd ever dreamed possible. And every Thursday, I dutifully prepared an envelope with 20% of the gross receipts and dropped it at the designated location. A different spot each week, always a public place where cash could change hands without attracting attention. I never saw who picked up the money. I never asked questions. I never tried to trace the phone number or investigate my mysterious benefactor. I told myself this was business, just unusual business. And as long as the arrangement worked for everyone involved, there was no reason to complicate things by being curious. Then we started making too much money. The first hint of trouble came during week 12 when the weekly drop location was a bench outside the West Side Market. I left the envelope as instructed, walked away, and turned back 5 minutes later to see a woman in a gray coat examining the contents with the focused attention of an accountant. She looked up, caught me watching, and for just a moment, our eyes met across the crowded market square. Her expression was not pleased. The phone call came that night. "Miss Castellanos, we need to talk about your recent performance." Same voice, but the careful politeness had developed an edge. "My performance business is great. I've been sending you exactly 20%, just like we agreed. Your numbers don't match our projections." "What projections? You never told me about any projections." "The projections we made when we decided to invest in your operation. Based on average food truck revenue in the Cleveland market, seasonal fluctuations, typical growth patterns for new businesses, your success has been anomalous." There was something in the way he said anomalous that made me think of medical terminology of things that grew where they shouldn't and had to be cut out before they spread. "I'm sorry I'm making too much money for you." "You're making too much money. Period. When a business outperforms expectations by this margin, it attracts attention. Attention from health inspectors, from tax authorities, from people who ask inconvenient questions about rapid success stories. We prefer our investments to maintain a lower profile. So what are you suggesting?" "We're suggesting you scale back operations, reduce hours, simplify the menu, maybe take some time off for personal reasons. Bring your revenue numbers back in line with realistic expectations for a business of your size and experience level." I felt something cold settling in my stomach. "And if I don't want to scale back, then we'll need to discuss alternative arrangements." The line went dead again, but this time the silence felt threatening rather than mysterious. I spent the next week in a paranoid haze, jumping at every unexpected sound, analyzing every customer's face for signs of surveillance or threat. The joy I'd found in cooking began to curdle into anxiety. Every perfect bangi felt like evidence of my own success, and success had apparently become a liability. But I couldn't bring myself to sabotage the business I'd built. These weren't just transactions. They were connections, relationships, a community of people who trusted me to feed them well. Mrs. Patterson from the insurance office, who ordered the same vermicelli bowl every Tuesday and always asked about my grandmother. Jake from the construction crew, who'd started bringing his whole team for lunch and tipped in cash because he knew how hard small business owners worked. The food bloggers who'd made us famous. The social media influencers who'd made us trendy. The regular customers who'd made us profitable. How do you deliberately fail the people who believe in you? How do you poison something you created with your own hands and heart? But even as I wrestled with these questions, part of me kept thinking about that strange food writer who never seemed to publish anything, who asked uncomfortable questions and watched me with predatory attention. There was something calculating about the way he studied my operation. something that made my skin crawl, even when he was ordering his usual pork banh mi with that practiced smile that never reached his eyes. I didn't scale back. I couldn't. Instead, I decided it was time to meet a mysterious partner face to face and negotiate new terms that would work for everyone. I was a businesswoman now, after all. Well, surely we could reach some kind of reasonable accommodation. I called the number on Thursday morning, right before the lunch rush. I want to meet. That's not how this works, Miss Castellana. It's how it's going to work now. I'm not some desperate kid anymore. This is my business, and I deserve to know who I'm working with. A long pause. You don't want to know who you're working with. Yes, I do. Name the place and time where I stopped sending money and start asking questions about where that $50,000 really came from. Another pause longer this time. You're making a mistake. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Friday night, 11 p.m. The parking lot behind Prosperity Social Club on Professor Avenue. Come alone, obviously. And Miss Castellaus, don't mistake this conversation for the beginning of a negotiation. This is us being polite enough to explain why negotiation isn't possible. The line went dead. Friday night came with a cold October rain that turned the parking lot behind Prosperity Social Club into a maze of puddles and shadows. I arrived at 10:50, parked under a broken street light, and waited with my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. At exactly 11 p.m., a black sedan pulled up next to my truck. The driver stayed behind the wheel while a woman got out of the passenger side. The same woman I'd seen examining my envelope at the West Side Market. Though up close she looked older and more dangerous than I'd initially realized. Mid-4s, average height, the kind of unremarkable appearance that was probably a professional asset. She wore dark jeans, a leather jacket, and the expression of someone who'd had this conversation before and knew exactly how it was going to end. "Veronica Castellanos," she said, approaching my truck with measured steps. "You want to meet? Here I am. You're my investor." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm someone who cleans up messes when investments don't perform as expected. My name is Janet Reeves, and I work for people who prefer not to work directly with the public. What kind of people? The kind who have a lot of money that needs to look like it came from legitimate sources. The kind who use food trucks, laundromats, car washes, and other small cash businesses to transform dirty money into clean tax returns. The kind who don't appreciate it when their carefully planned operations start generating attention because some amateur gets lucky and makes too much real money. The pieces clicked into place with the sick logic of a puzzle you never wanted to solve. Money laundering. I'd been running a front without knowing it, a successful front, which meant the fake books my silent partners were keeping match the real revenue I was generating. In their ledgers, Banh Mi Boulevard was supposed to be a modestly profitable small business that processed a predetermined amount of illicit cash each week. In reality, we were a phenomenon that was making legitimate money on top of the dirty money, which meant their numbers were wrong, and someone somewhere was going to notice the discrepancy. "How many food trucks do you run?" I asked. 17 in Cleveland, 8 in Columbus, 12 in Cincinnati, all carefully calibrated to generate exactly the right amount of income to justify exactly the right amount of cash transactions, all run by people who are either too stupid to ask questions or too smart to survive asking them. And Rico, did he ask questions? Janet's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Rico got greedy, started skimming from his drops, thought we wouldn't notice a few hundred here and there. We gave him a choice: disappear voluntarily or be disappeared permanently. He chose wisely. So he's alive as far as I know, probably running a taco stand in Phoenix or Portland under a different name. Hopefully smart enough to keep his mouth shut and his hands out of other people's money. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by a new kind of fear. What choice are you giving me? Same choice we gave Rico, with modifications appropriate to your situation. Option 1. You scale back operations immediately and permanently. We're talking 50% reduction in hours, simplified menu, reduced quality. Whatever it takes to bring your numbers back in line with our projections. You become the kind of food truck owner you were supposed to be, someone who makes enough money to survive, but not enough to thrive. And option 2 is more complicated. See, your success has created a problem that goes beyond simple revenue management. You've built a brand, a reputation, a following. People expect Banh Mi Boulevard to be extraordinary. Now, if you suddenly start serving mediocre food, they'll notice. They'll ask questions. They'll investigate. Janet pulled out her phone and showed me a series of photos, screenshots of social media posts, food blog reviews, local news articles about Cleveland's hottest food truck. You've made yourself visible, Veronica. Visibility is the enemy of our business model. So what are you suggesting? We're suggesting you help us solve the visibility problem by creating a different kind of story. A tragedy that explains why Banh Mi Boulevard suddenly isn't what it used to be. Something that generates sympathy instead of suspicion. My hands were shaking now, and I pressed on them against my thighs to keep Janet from noticing. What kind of tragedy? The kind that involves someone close to the operation disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Someone whose absence would be devastating enough to explain a dramatic decline in food quality and business performance. Someone whose disappearance would be investigated briefly, mourned publicly, and then forgotten as Cleveland moves on to the next hot food trend. The parking lot suddenly felt much colder. You want me to kill someone? We want you to solve a business problem using the resources at your disposal. What that solution looks like is up to you, but it needs to be permanent. It needs to be believable, and it needs to happen within the next 2 weeks. And if I refuse, then you become the tragedy instead of the author of it. And we find someone else to run a nice, quiet, profitable food truck that serves adequate Vietnamese food to people who don't know any better. Janet walked back toward the sedan, then turned around one last time. Think about it over the weekend, Veronica, but don't think too long. We got 17 other trucks to manage, and we can't let one ambitious cook derail the entire operation. The sedan pulled away, leaving me alone in the parking lot with the rain and the terrible arithmetic of survival. Make someone else disappear or disappear myself. Frame someone for a crime or become the victim of one. Destroy another person's life or watch mine be destroyed instead. I drove home in a daze, my mind cycling through options that all led to the same dark conclusion. There was no way out of this that didn't involve someone getting hurt. The only question was whether that someone would be me or someone I chose to sacrifice. By Saturday morning, I'd made my decision. By Sunday afternoon, I'd made my plan. By Monday, I was ready to become the kind of person who could do what needed to be done. The knife still felt good in my hand as I prepped vegetables for the lunch rush. And I found myself thinking about precision, about cutting through problems with the right tool applied at the right angle, with the right amount of pressure. I thought about Rico somewhere in Phoenix or Portland, probably wondering if he'd made the right choice. I thought about Janet Reeves and her careful explanations, and her 17 food trucks full of people who didn't know they were washing money for criminals. Mostly, I thought about the customer who'd been coming to my truck every day for the past month. That self-proclaimed food writer who had been making me uneasy since week 4. Always ordering the same thing. Always paying in cash. Always asking too many questions about my suppliers and my background and my business model. The one who claimed to be a food blogger but never took pictures of his meals. Who said he was writing an article about Cleveland's food scene but never seemed to publish anything. Who looked at me with the focused attention of someone gathering information rather than simply enjoying lunch. The one whose disappearance would be a morning briefly, and then forgotten because food bloggers come and go, and nobody really keeps track of freelance writers who claim to be working on articles that never seem to get published. The one who'd be coming to my truck in exactly 20 minutes because he always came at exactly 12:30 and always ordered the pork bun me with extra pickled vegetables. I finished julienning the carrots and moved on to prep work. They required a bigger knife, a sharper edge, and a steadier hand. Some problems could only be solved by cutting through them completely, and I'd learned that success meant being willing to do whatever it took to protect what you'd built. Even if what you'd built was rotten from the foundation up, even if protecting it meant becoming something you'd never planned to become. The lunch rush was about to begin, and I had a customer to serve one last time. And the following story, Caroline's face went white. The accident. You swerved to avoid a truck on the interstate. You've been unconscious for 3 days. She spoke rapidly, as if speed might force recognition. We have 3 children. Penelope, Christopher, Edmund. We live on Commerce Street. You own the bookshop downtown. Hugh felt nothing. No memory stirred. No emotional connection sparked. The bookshop, though, that resonated faintly, like an echo from a distant room. I'll get the doctor, Carolyn said, rising abruptly. Her movement seemed unnecessarily precise, controlled. Alone, Hugh tried to inventory what he remembered. His bookshop, certainly. Farrington's rare books, with its narrow aisles and the smell of old leather. His apartment above it sparse but comfortable. Eating meals alone, reading late into the night. The contentment of solitude, but a wife. Children. 12 years of marriage as Caroline claimed nothing. When she returned with Dr. Peton, Hugh submitted to the usual neurological tests. The diagnosis was predictable. Retrograde amnesia following severe concussion. Personal memories affected. General knowledge intact. Recovery likely but uncertain. Your family will help, Dr. Peton assured him. Familiar faces, familiar routines. These often act as catalysts. The children arrived next. 3 small strangers who called him Daddy with voices tight with worry. Christopher, 11, with Hugh's own gray eyes. Penelope, 8, hanging back by the door. Edmund, 4, clutching a stuffed rabbit. Hello, he said, feeling like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. They stayed briefly, their presence filling the room with expectant energy that you couldn't match. After they left, he lay in the growing darkness, wondering why a man would forget his children's faces, but remember every book in his shop's inventory. That night, Hugh woke to find a slip of paper under his pillow. Block letters carefully printed. They aren't yours. Don't let them tuck you in. His heart hammered against his ribs. Who could have left this? Hospital security was tight. The nurses all knew Caroline, and the children spoke warmly of the devoted family that barely left his side. Yet here was this warning placed where only he would find it. Hugh hid the note and tried to sleep, but questions multiplied in the darkness. If Caroline was truly his wife, why did her touch feel wrong? If these were his children, why did he feel nothing when they looked at him with such obvious need? Morning brought discharge papers and Caroline's announcement that everything was ready for his homecoming. She drove him through Natch streets he recognized to a white Victorian house with green shutters that felt like a stranger's home. Inside, Caroline had prepared everything perfectly, too perfectly. His study was exactly as she claimed he'd left it, down to the orange cat named Mr. Whiskers, sleeping in the leather chair. But nothing felt familiar, despite overwhelming evidence that this was his life. In the desk drawer, Hugh found photographs. His wedding to Caroline, holding babies, family Christmas mornings. The images were authentic. Definitely him. Definitely her. Definitely a life lived together. But they felt like someone else's memories borrowed rather than owned. That evening, 3 days into his supposed recovery, Hugh excused himself and walked to his bookshop. The key on Caroline's ring worked perfectly. Inside, everything was as he remembered. The narrow aisles, the careful organization, the satisfaction of books properly cared for. But when he climbed the stairs to what Caroline claimed was a long sold apartment, he found something impossible. His current home, rumpled sheets, coffee cups in the sink, clothes in the closet, a lease agreement dated 6 months ago. This was where he lived. This was real. Hidden under the bed was a shoe box containing documents that made his blood freeze. Marriage certificate dated 6 months ago, not 12 years. Birth certificates for the children dated even more recently, some only 3 months old. Everything Caroline had told him was a lie. Footsteps on the shop floor below interrupted his discovery. Voices, Caroline sharp with worry, and another he recognized as his assistant Bertram, told you he was asking questions. He didn't think he would remember if he finds the apartment. Hugh climbed out the fire escape window, his mind reeling. Bertram, who he'd trusted, was part of whatever deception surrounded him. But deception toward what end? Why create an elaborate false family? Walking aimlessly through Natchez as Hugh tried to process the impossible. If his marriage was recent, not 12-year-old, then what about the children? How do you create 3 children with complete personalities and memories overnight? Unless the thought hit him like a physical blow. Unless they weren't his children at all. Unless they belonged to someone else. The real Hugh Farrington, whose life had been stolen. And if that was true, where was the real Hugh Farrington now? The answer came with horrible clarity. Exactly where everyone expected him to be. But in a place where his protests would be dismissed as delusions. Hugh walked to the Natchez State Hospital with growing certainty. If there really was another Hugh Farrington, that's where he'd be, in the psychiatric ward, claiming his identity had been stolen, insisting his family was missing. Getting inside required careful timing, but Hugh managed to slip through a side entrance behind a staff member. The psychiatric ward was on the 3rd floor. The nurse at the desk confirmed what Hugh hoped and dreaded to find. Hugh Farrington, room 312. Poor man thinks people have stolen his identity, kidnapped his family. Complete break with reality. Room 312 contained a man who looked exactly like Hugh Farrington. Not similar, identical. Same face, same scar on the chin, same everything. The other Hugh looked up as Hugh entered, and their eyes met. "You," the other Hugh said quietly. "You're me?" "Yes." "Then you know what they've done." Hugh closed the door behind him. "Tell me." "They took everything. My wife, my children, my life. Caroline, Christopher, Penelope, Edmund, they were mine. Really mine. We were happy." The other Hugh's voice broke. "I woke up here 3 months ago, and they said I was delusional. But I know what's real. I've been living with them. You said they think I'm their father. Of course they do. That's how she makes it work. How is it possible? 2 identical people." Before the other Hugh could answer, the door opened. Caroline entered, followed by Dr. Whitfield, the ward psychiatrist. "There you are," Caroline said, her mask of concern slipping. "Hill, you're not well. This delusion about having a double. Which one of us are you talking to?" Hugh asked, looking between Caroline and the broken man on the bed. Caroline moved toward Hugh, but he stepped away. "How did you do it? How did you split one person into 2? "You're confused," Caroline said, but panic flickered in her eyes. "Had injuries can cause. I found the documents. Marriage certificate 6 months ago, not 12 years. Recent birth certificates for the children. Everything you told me was a lie." The other Hugh sat up straighter. "The children's birth certificates are recent. Very recent." Horror dawned in the other Hugh's eyes. "They're not birth certificates. They're adoption papers. She didn't just steal me. She replaced my children with different ones." The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. "Where are they?" Hugh demanded. Where are his real wife and children? Caroline's composure finally cracked completely. Instead of fleeing, she stepped back into the room and closed the door. "You want the truth." Her voice had changed, become something cold and alien. "Fine." She looked between the 2 Hugh Farringtons with something that might have been regret. "Neither of you is the real Hugh Farrington. He died in that car accident 3 months ago. What you are, both of you are echoes, fragments of a consciousness that couldn't let go." The words hit like physical blows. Hugh felt reality shift beneath him. "That's impossible," he said. "Is it?" You both wondered how 2 identical people could exist. You both puzzled over memories that don't fit, emotions that won't connect. You're fragments of a dead man's psyche. The other you sank back on the bed. "My children were never yours. They're orphans. I'm caring for 3 children who needed a home." Caroline's voice softened slightly. I thought I could give them a father. I thought the echo of Hugh Farrington could love them. But I remember," the other Hugh whispered. "You remember what Hugh would have remembered if he'd lived to have children. Your ghosts haunting a life that might have been." Hugh felt his certainties dissolving. Why create us at all? Because I loved him. Hugh Farrington was special. When he died, I couldn't accept it. So, I found a way to bring back part of him. How does it matter? Love, desperation, refusal to accept ending. I wanted to undo death itself. Hugh looked at his other self and saw his own future. Gradual dissolution, slow unraveling of borrowed consciousness. The note in the hospital, the part of Hugh that fought back, even fragmented. He was trying to protect himself from the lie I'd created. Hugh felt the first waves of dissolution beginning, edges of consciousness loosening. What happens now? Now you choose. Continue pretending or accept what you are and find peace in letting go. The children, what happens to them? They'll be cared for. They'll find their way to real lives, not fantasies. The other spoke weakly. Tell them the man who pretended to be their father loved them as much as a ghost can love. Caroline nodded, tears starting. I will. Hugh felt himself become entranced, insubstantial. The room grew less solid, edges blurred. Thank you, he said to Caroline, meaning it despite everything. You gave us existence we wouldn't have had otherwise. I am sorry, she whispered. Don't be. Take care of them. Live the life we couldn't. The other Hugh was fading too, but his eyes remained fixed on Carolyn with forgiveness. Take care of them, he echoed. All of them. And then they were gone, dissolved back into whatever void had given them temporary form, leaving only the impression of two men who had briefly loved a family that was never quite their own. Caroline stood alone with Dr. Whitfield staring at empty space. What did I just witness? The doctor whispered. The end of a story that should never have been written, and the beginning of whatever comes next. She turned toward the corridor, toward 3 children who would wake tomorrow to find their temporary father had vanished like a dream. There would be questions and grief, but also truth finally. Behind her, the room settled into emptiness, holding only lingering warmth. Where 2 impossible men had briefly existed, loved him perfectly, and chosen how their stories would end. The Mississippi River continued its eternal flow past Natchez, carrying away remnants of one story while preparing to witness countless others. In the distance, a bookshop stood empty, waiting for someone new to discover the treasures hidden among its shelves. Every image, Hugh appeared relaxed, happy, genuinely connected to these people who now felt like strangers to him. The photographs disturbed him more than anything else had. They were not simply evidence of his marriage and fatherhood. They were evidence of his emotional investment in these relationships. The man in these pictures loved his wife and children. That much was clear from his expression, his body language, the way he held them close to his side. But if that man was truly him, then where had those feelings gone? How could love simply vanish, leaving no trace behind? Hugh was so absorbed in the photographs that he didn't hear the soft footsteps in the hallway, only when a small voice said, "Daddy." Did he look up to find Edmund standing in the doorway, clutching a stuffed rabbit? "Hello, Edmund," Hugh said. carefully replacing the photographs in the drawer. "Mommy says you're sick," Edmund said, approaching with the fearless curiosity of a 4-year-old. "But you look the same." "I am the same," Hugh said, though he wasn't certain this was true. "I just can't remember some things right now." "Like what?" Like your birthday party when you turned 4. Edmund brightened. "It was at the park. We had a pirate cake, and you wore the hat with the feather, and you made all the other daddies walk the plank off the picnic table." Hugh tried to picture this scene himself, in a pirate hat, entertaining children at a birthday party, but the image remained stubbornly elusive. "That sounds like fun," he said. "It was the best party ever," Edmund said solemnly. "Even better than Christopher's party last year when the magician made the rabbit disappear and it never came back." "What happened to the rabbit?" "Christopher thinks it went to rabbit heaven, but Penelope says it probably just ran away because it was scared of the magic words. I think maybe it's still hiding somewhere, waiting for the right person to find it." There was something in the child's matter-of-fact acceptance of mystery that resonated with Hugh's current situation. Perhaps he too was like that rabbit, not gone exactly, but hiding, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge from whatever dark place he had retreated to. "Edmund," Caroline's voice called from somewhere deeper in the house. "Where are you, sweetheart?" "I'm talking to Daddy," Edmund called back. "Well, don't tire him out. He needs his rest." Edmund leaned closer to Hugh, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Are you going to get better soon?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I hope so." "Me too," Edmund said. "It's not the same when you're not really you." The child's observation was so perceptive that Hugh felt a chill run down his spine. "You're not really you." Was that what was happening?
Was he becoming someone else?
Or was someone else becoming him? That evening, the family gathered in the dining room for what Caroline announced was Hugh's favorite meal: roast chicken with rosemary, mashed potatoes, and green beans from their own garden. The food was expertly prepared and undeniably delicious, but he found himself wondering how Caroline could be so certain of his preferences when he himself was not. The conversation was carefully orchestrated, with Caroline steering the discussion towards safe topics, and the children contributing observations about school and friends and neighborhood happenings. Hugh participated as best he could, but he felt like an actor in a play for which he had not been given a script. "Mrs. Hartwell from next door asked about you," Carolyn said as she served dessert. A peach cobbler that she claimed was made from his mother's recipe. "She wanted to know when you'd be well enough for visitors." "What did you tell her?" "That you were recovering well, but needed time to rest." "She understood, of course. She's been through her own health struggles." Hugh nodded, though he had no idea who Mrs. Hartwell was or what her health struggles might have been. The entire neighborhood apparently was populated with people who knew him better than he knew himself. After dinner, Caroline supervised the children's baths and bedtime routines, while Hugh retreated to his study. The guest room she had prepared for him was comfortable enough, but he found himself drawn to the space that felt, if not familiar, then at least authentically his own. He was examining the books on his shelves, a collection that reflected his professional interests. but also revealed personal tastes he could not remember developing when he heard a soft knock at the door. "Come in," he called, expecting to see Carolyn. Instead, it was Christopher who entered, already in his pajamas, his dark hair damp from his bath. "I wanted to say good night," the boy said, hovering near the door with the same weariness his siblings had shown. "Good night, Christopher," Hugh said. "Sleep well." The boy didn't leave immediately. Instead, he studied Hugh's face with those serious gray eyes that were so disconcertingly like his own. "You really don't remember anything about us, do you?" Christopher asked. Hugh considered lying, offering some reassurance that might ease the child's obvious distress. But something in Christopher's expression suggested he would see through any deception. "No," Hugh said quietly. "I'm sorry, but I don't." Christopher nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "The night before your accident, you came to my room to say goodnight. You told me you were going to Jackson to look at some old books and that you'd bring me back something special. Do you remember what you promised to bring me?" Hugh felt the familiar frustration of reaching for a memory that simply wasn't there. "I'm sorry, Christopher. I don't remember." "A compass," Christopher said. "An old brass compass from a ship. You said every explorer needs a good compass to find his way home. The irony of the gift was not lost on you. Here he was, more lost than any explorer, without even the most basic compass to guide him back to his own life. I'm sure when I'm feeling better, we can find you that compass," Hugh said. "Maybe," Christopher said, but his tone suggested he was not optimistic about Hugh's recovery. "Good night, Daddy." After the boy left, Hugh sat in the leather chair recently vacated by Mr. Whiskers and tried to process the day's events. The house, the photographs, the children's matter-of-fact acceptance of him as their father. All of it suggested that he was indeed Hugh Farrington, husband and father, a man who had somehow lost 12 years of his life to a head injury. But the note hidden in his hospital drawer suggested otherwise. "They aren't yours. Don't let them tuck you in." As if summoned by his thoughts, Caroline appeared in the doorway, wearing a flowered robe and carrying a small tray. "I thought you might like some tea before bed," she said. "Chamomile to help you sleep." She set the tray on his desk and poured the tea with practiced efficiency. The steam rose fragrant and soothing, and you found himself grateful for the gesture even as he wondered about its motivation. "Are you comfortable in the guest room?" Caroline asked. "I put fresh sheets on the bed, and there are extra blankets in the closet if you get cold." "Thank you. You've been very kind." Caroline's smile was soft, tinged with sadness. "You don't have to thank me, Hugh. I'm your wife. Taking care of you is what I do." She moved closer, and for a moment, Hugh thought she might kiss him good night. Instead, she reached out and straightened his collar, her fingers lingering briefly against his neck. "Don't let them tuck you in," the note had warned. Was this what it meant? This gentle, whiffly attention that felt somehow invasive, possessive. "Sleep well," Caroline said, her hand trailing briefly across his shoulder before she turned to leave. "Tomorrow will be a better day. You'll see." After she left, Hugh stared at the cup of tea without drinking it. The liquid was pale gold, innocuous looking, but he found himself reluctant to consume anything Caroline had prepared. The paranoia felt foolish, but he could not shake the memory of the note's urgent warning. Instead of drinking the tea, he carried the cup to the guest room Caroline had prepared for him. The room was pleasant enough, decorated in muted blues and greens, with a four-poster bed that looked both comfortable and somehow confining. Hugh set the teacup on the bedside table and examined the room more carefully. The closet contained clothes that were apparently his, shirts and trousers in his size, shoes that showed the wear patterns of his feet. But like everything else in this house, they felt like costumes, garments chosen for him by someone else to help him play a role he didn't remember accepting. He undressed carefully, favoring his injured ribs, and climbed into the unfamiliar bed. The sheets smelled of lavender and starch, clean and domestic. But as he lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the house settling around him, Hugh found himself thinking about his apartment above the bookshop. In his memory, it was sparse, almost monastic, but it was undeniably his own space. No one else's possessions cluttered the rooms. No one else's preferences shaped the arrangement of furniture or the choice of colors. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams of corridors and doorways, of voices calling his name from rooms he could never quite reach. He dreamed of Carolyn's hands adjusting his blankets, of children's faces watching him from the shadows, of a note written in block letters that grew larger and larger until the words filled his entire field of vision. They aren't yours. He woke in the gray light of dawn to find his sheets soaked with perspiration and his heart racing with unnamed fear. The house was quiet around him, but he could sense the presence of other people beyond his door. The family that claimed him, that insisted he belonged to them as much as they belonged to him. Hugh rose and dressed quietly, then slipped out of the guest room and through the house to the back door. The garden was larger than it had appeared from the street, with carefully tended beds of flowers and vegetables, a wooden swing hanging from the branches of an old oak tree, and a small shed that presumably contained gardening tools. In the early morning light, the domesticity of the scene should have been comforting. This was the life he had supposedly built, the home he had chosen, the family he had cherished. But instead of comfort, Hugh felt only a growing sense of wrongness, as if he were an intruder in someone else's paradise. He walked to the gate at the back of the garden and found it unlocked. Beyond lay an alley that ran between the houses on Commerce Street and the parallel avenue behind it. Hugh had no destination in mind, but he found himself walking toward the historic district, toward the river, toward the bookshop that was the one place in this strange new world that felt authentically his own. The streets were empty at this early hour, populated only by the occasional jogger or dog walker. Hugh moved carefully, favoring his injured ribs, but with a sense of purpose that had been absent since his awakening in the hospital. Whatever was happening to him, whatever elaborate deception or genuine medical condition had stolen his memory, he needed to find answers. And those answers, he felt certain, lay not in the perfect domestic tableau of Commerce Street, but in the life he could actually remember. Bertram was already at the shop when Hugh arrived, unlocking the front door with the careful precision of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. He was older than Hugh had expected, perhaps 70, with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him the appearance of a scholarly librarian. Mr. Farrington Bertram's face lit up with genuine pleasure and relief. "My dear fellow, how wonderful to see you up and about. I've been so worried since Mrs. Farrington called about the accident." "Hello, Bertram," Hugh said, and was pleased to find that the name felt natural on his tongue. The first thing in days that it felt entirely right. Come in," Bertram fussed, ushering Hugh into the shop. "You shouldn't be out so early, surely, and in your condition." "I needed to see the shop," Hugh said, "to see if it would help with your memory." Bertram finished, his expression understanding. "Of course, my dear fellow, quite natural. This place has been your life's work after all." Hugh moved slowly through the narrow aisles, running his fingers along the spines of books that felt familiar and foreign at once. The organization was logical. Fiction alphabetical by author, non-fiction by subject. Rare books in a climate-controlled case near the back. But the specific titles, the individual volumes, remained stubbornly unfamiliar. You were particularly excited about an acquisition you'd made just before the accident, Bertram said, watching Hugh's face carefully. A first edition of Poe's Tales of the Grotesque in arabesque. He'd been looking for a copy for years, you said. "It's in the safe if you'd like to see it." Hugh nodded, and Bertram led him to a small office behind the main shop. The safe was hidden behind a painting of a Mississippi riverboat, and Bertram opened it with a combination he seemed to know by heart. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue, was a slim volume bound in dark green cloth. Even before Bertram unwrapped it completely, Hugh felt a stirring of recognition, not of the specific book, but of the hunt that had led to its acquisition. The satisfaction of finally locating a volume that had eluded him for years. "You paid quite handsomely for it," Bertram said, handling the book with the reverence it deserved. The dealer in Jackson was reluctant to part with it, but you convinced him that it would be properly cared for here. Jackson. The word struck you like a physical blow. Caroline had said he was returning from Jackson when the accident occurred, but according to Bertram, he had gone there to acquire this book, a transaction he could vaguely remember contemplating, but not completing. "When exactly did I purchase this?" you asked. Bertram consulted a ledger on the desk. "Let me see. Yes, here it is. You departed for Jackson on a Tuesday morning, completed the transaction that afternoon, and were driving back when the accident occurred that same evening." Hugh stared at the book, trying to reconcile Bertram's account with Carolyn's. She had spoken of the journey to Jackson as if it were routine, a business trip among many. But Bertram's description suggested something more significant, a culmination of years of searching, a prize finally won. "Bertram," you said carefully, "how long have you known me?" "Oh, 15 years now. Ever since you opened the shop. I was your first employee." You said you needed someone who understood books not just as commodities, but as, or what was the phrase you used? Yes, as repositories of human longing. And in all that time, what have I told you about my personal life, my family? Bertram's expression grew thoughtful, as if he were sorting through years of conversations. You were always quite private about such matters, Mr. Finkton. I knew you were married, of course, and that you had children, but you rarely spoke of them in detail. I always assumed you preferred to keep your business and domestic lives separate. When did I marry Carolyn? Oh, that would have been, let me think, 12 years ago. Yes, I remember, because you took an unusually long honeymoon, 2 weeks in England, visiting antiquarian bookshops. You came back with some marvelous acquisitions and a new appreciation for medieval manuscripts. The timeline matched what Caroline had told him, but something in Bertram's tone suggested a certain detachment from these personal details, as if he were recounting information he had learned secondhand rather than witnessed firsthand. Did you attend the wedding? Hugh asked. Bertram paused, his hand still resting on the volume. I don't believe I did. You said it was to be a small affair, family only. I was quite understanding. Of course, not everyone wishes to mix their professional and personal circles. And the children, have you met them? Briefly, on a few occasions, when Mrs. Finkton brought them to the shop. Charming youngsters, though I must confess, I'm not particularly comfortable around children. You seem devoted to them, of course. Hugh felt a growing unease as Bertram's answers revealed the curious isolation between his professional and personal lives. In his recovered memories of the bookshop, he had always been alone. No family photographs on his desk. No personal calls interrupting his work. No domestic concerns intruding on his bibliophilic pursuits. Could 15 years of marriage and fatherhood really leave so little trace in the place where he spent most of his waking hours? Is there somewhere I can sit and think? You asked. Somewhere quiet. Of course, my dear fellow. Your office upstairs is exactly as you left it. I haven't touched a thing. Bertram led him to a narrow staircase you hadn't noticed before, tucked behind a section of philosophy texts. The steps creaked familiarly under his feet, and Hugh found himself remembering the particular rhythm required to avoid the squeakiest boards. The office above was small and cramped, with a single window overlooking the alley behind the shop, but it felt more like home than anything on Commerce Street had. The desk was an old oak piece scarred by years of use, and the walls were lined with books that showed the signs of frequent handling. This was a working space, a place where serious thought occurred. Hugh settled into the chair behind the desk and was immediately struck by how perfectly it accommodated his body. The height was exactly right, the angle of the back perfectly suited to his posture. He had sat in this chair countless times, had made it conformed to his needs through years of use. On the desk was a leather-bound journal, the sort used for business records and correspondence notes. Hugh opened it and found entries in his own handwriting dating back several months. Most were routine records of acquisitions, notes about customers, reminders about catalog deadlines. But as he read more carefully, Hugh noticed something odd about the personal references scattered throughout the entries. March 15th. Acquired lovely first edition. Dickens from estate sale. Must remember C's birthday next week. She mentioned wanting garden tools. April 2nd. Christopher asking about trip to Memphis Book Fair told him maybe next year when he's older. May 10th. Edmund's preschool graduation tomorrow. Caroline insists I attend. Such things always make me uncomfortable. The entries referring to his family had a different quality from the rest. Stilted, formal, as if he were reminding himself about obligations rather than recording cherished moments. There was no warmth in these references, no indication of emotional attachment. If anything, they read like the notes of someone trying to remember the details of a role he was required to play. Hugh flipped to more recent entries, looking for some record of the trip to Jackson that had ended in his accident. August 20th, Dealer and Jackson finally agreed to terms for the Poe, leaving Tuesday morning. This acquisition represents years of searching. Will be good to have it settled at last. August 21st, Jackson successful. Amazing condition on the Poe, binding intact. All pages present. No foxing. Worth every penny of asking price. Driving back this evening. Looking forward to cataloging properly. There the entries ended. Hugh stared at the final notation, searching for some clue about what had happened next. But there was nothing beyond his professional satisfaction with the acquisition and his intention to return home that evening. He closed the journal and leaned back in the chair, trying to process what he had learned. According to every source, Caroline, the children, Dr. Petton, even Bertram, he was a married man with a family he loved. But his own private writing suggested someone going through the motions of domestic life without any genuine emotional investment. It was as if two different men shared the same body. The Hugh Farrington who loved rare books and cherished his solitude, and the Hugh Finkton who had somehow acquired a wife and children he felt obligated to care for, but didn't particularly enjoy. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Farrington," Bertram's voice called. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's someone here to see you." Hugh made his way downstairs to find Caroline standing near the front counter, her face tight with worry and what might have been anger. "Hugh, thank God," she said, moving toward him with quick steps. "When I found the guest room empty, I was terrified. You're not supposed to be walking around on your own so soon after." "I'm fine," Hugh said, though he noticed that Bertram had retreated diplomatically to the back of the shop. "I needed to see the bookshop. You could have asked me to drive you, or at least left a note. I was imagining all sorts of horrible scenarios." There was something in Caroline's tone that went beyond wheelie concern. It sounded almost possessive, as if his unauthorized absence had been a kind of betrayal. "I'm sorry," you said. "I didn't think you'd worry. I just walked a few blocks. In your condition, with broken ribs and a head injury. Hugh, you're not thinking clearly. That's exactly why you need supervision." Supervision. The word hung in the air between them. loaded with implications that made Hugh's skin crawl. He was not a child or an invalid, requiring constant oversight. He was a grown man who had managed his own affairs for decades. "I think I'm capable of deciding whether I'm well enough for a short walk," Hugh said, his voice cooler than he had intended. Caroline's expression shifted, hurt replacing irritation. "Of course you are. I didn't mean to sound. I'm just worried about you. We all are." The children were asking where Daddy had gone when they woke up. The guilt was expertly applied, but Hugh found himself resistant to it. If these were indeed his children, wouldn't he feel some natural concern for their distress? Instead, he felt only the same detached sympathy he might feel for any children facing uncertainty. "I'll be more considerate in the future," Hugh said, though the promise felt hollow even as he made it. The drive back to Commerce Street was conducted in uncomfortable silence. Caroline seemed to be struggling with emotions she didn't want to express, while Hugh found himself studying the familiar streets with new eyes. This was supposedly his neighborhood, his community, but it felt no more like home than any other collection of houses and trees. The children were waiting on the front porch when they arrived, their relief at seeing him both touching and inexplicable. If he truly was their father, their concern was natural. "But if he wasn't, you got lost," Penelope said as he approached the house. "I went to see my bookshop," you explained, "to remember some things." "Did it work?" Christopher asked, his serious gray eyes searching Hugh's face. "Not exactly," he admitted. That afternoon, while Caroline busied herself with household tasks that seemed designed to keep her within sight of wherever Hugh happened to be, he found himself drawn back to his study. The photographs hidden in the desk drawer continued to trouble him, not their existence, but their apparent authenticity. The man in those pictures genuinely seemed to love the people around him, yet Hugh could summon no echo of those feelings. He was examining the wedding photo more closely when he noticed something that made his breath catch. In the background, barely visible behind the happy couple, was a figure he recognized. Bertram standing with a small group of what appeared to be other wedding guests. But Bertram had distinctly told him that morning that he hadn't attended the wedding, that it had been family only. Either Bertram had lied, or his memory was as unreliable as everyone claimed Hugh's was. But why would Bertram lie about such a thing? What possible motivation could he have for denying his presence at his employer's wedding? Hugh studied the photo more carefully, looking for other details that might contradict the story he had been told. The setting appeared to be a church, though he couldn't identify which one. Caroline's dress was elegant but simple, suggesting either modest means or modest tastes. His own expression was one of happiness, but now that he looked more closely, there was something performative about it, as if he were conscious of being photographed and determined to appear appropriately joyful. The more he stared at the image, the more it seemed like a tableau arranged for public consumption rather than a candid moment of private joy. Even Caroline's smile, genuine though it appeared, had a quality of satisfaction that struck Hugh as oddly triumphant. as if she had achieved something significant rather than simply marrying the man she loved. A soft scratching at the study door announced the arrival of Mr. Whiskers, who entered with the confident air of a creature who knew he was welcome everywhere. The cat leaped onto Hugh's lap and began purring, a sound that vibrated through Hugh's injured ribs, but was nonetheless oddly comforting. "At least you seem to remember me," Hugh murmured, stroking the cat's orange and white fur. Mr. Whiskers purred louder, kneading Hugh's thigh with sharp claws that penetrated even the fabric of his trousers. There was something almost desperate in the cat's affection, as if it had been starved for his attention during his absence. "How long have I been gone, really?" he asked the cat, who naturally provided no answer beyond continued purring. The question hung in the air, unanswered, but increasingly urgent. According to Caroline and Dr. Peton, he had been unconscious for 3 days following the accident. But what if that wasn't true? What if he had been missing for longer, weeks, months, even years? What if the life he remembered, the solitary existence above the bookshop, was not his past, but his recent reality? And everything else was an elaborate construction designed to convince him otherwise. The possibility was so unsettling that Hugh found himself examining it despite its apparent absurdity. But if it were true, it would explain so much. His complete lack of emotional connection to his supposed family, the strange quality of his private writings about them, the way every supposed memory of domestic life remained stubbornly absent despite the overwhelming evidence of its existence. That evening, dinner passed in a careful orchestration of normally. Carolyn had prepared what she claimed was another of his favorite meals, beef stew with cornbread, and the children chatted about their day at school with the forced cheer of actors playing happy children in a domestic drama. Hugh participated as best he could, but he felt increasingly like an imposter in his own life. After the children were in bed, Caroline joined him in the living room with 2 glasses of wine and the obvious intention of having a serious conversation. "Hugh," she began, settling under the sofa beside him, "I know this is difficult for you. I can't imagine what it must be like to look at your own family and feel nothing, but I want you to know that we're going to get through this together. What if my memory doesn't return?" You asked. "What if this is permanent?" Caroline took a sip of wine before answering, as if buying time to choose her words carefully. "Then we'll build new memories. We'll fall in love again, if necessary. The important thing is that you're alive, that you're here with us." There was something in her tone that struck Hugh as rehearsed, as if she had practiced the speech. The sentiment was touching, but it felt calculated in a way that genuine emotion rarely did. "Carolyn," Hugh said carefully, "may I ask you something that might sound strange? Of course, before the accident, was I happy in our marriage? I mean, with our life together?" Caroline's wine glass paused halfway to her lips. "What do you mean? I mean, did I seem content, fulfilled? Did I talk about feeling trapped, or wanting things to be different?" "Hugh, why would you ask such a thing?" "Because I found some things in my study, my journal from the bookshop, the way I wrote about our family. It didn't sound like a man who was particularly happy with his domestic situation. Caroline set down her wine glass with a sharp clink against the coffee table. You were always a private person, Hugh. You didn't wear your emotions on your sleeve. But yes, you were happy. We were happy. Ask anyone who knew us. I did ask someone. I asked Bertram about our wedding, and he said he didn't attend, but I found a photograph that clearly shows him there. Carolyn's face went through a series of subtle transformations: surprise, confusion, and something that might have been calculation. Bertram is getting older, Hugh. Perhaps his memory isn't as reliable as it once was. Or perhaps someone is lying to me. The words hung between them like an accusation. Caroline's eyes, those green eyes that had seemed so kind in the hospital, now held something harder, more dangerous. Who would lie to you and why? I don't know, Hugh admitted, but something is wrong here. I can feel it. Caroline reached for his hand, her grip firm and oddly cold. Hugh, you're paranoid. It's a common side effect of head injuries. Dr. Peton warned me this might happen. You're looking for conspiracies where none exist. Then explain the note, you said. What? No. Hugh hadn't intended to mention the warning he'd found under his hospital pillow, but the words escaped before he could stop them. Caroline's reaction, a subtle tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible pause, convinced him that she knew exactly what he was talking about. Someone left me a note in the hospital. Hugh continued, watching her face carefully. It warned me not to trust you. All of you. That's a Carolyn seemed to struggle for words. That's impossible. Who would do such a thing? And how would they get into your room? I was hoping you might tell me. Carolyn stood abruptly, her wine glass forgotten. Hugh, you're frightening me. As paranoia, these accusations, it's not like you. You're not well. Perhaps we should call Dr. Peton. Perhaps we should. You agreed. I'd like to ask him some questions about my case, about how long I was really unconscious, about whether anyone else has been asking questions about my condition. Something flickered across Caroline's face. Fear, anger, or perhaps calculation. I think you should rest, she said firmly. You've had too much excitement today. Your first day home should have been peaceful. But instead, you went wandering off on your own, dredging up unnecessary worries. Carolyn, his voice was quiet but firm. I want to see my apartment. What apartment? The apartment above the bookshop where I lived before we were married. I want to see if it's still there. Hugh, that apartment was sold years ago. You moved out when we married, remember? Or rather, when your memory returns, you'll remember. But Hugh was already shaking his head. I don't think that's true. I think I still live there. I think that's where I was living right up until the accident. Caroline's composure finally cracked. That's ridiculous. Hugh, look around you. Look at this house. At our children. At the life we've built together. How can you doubt what's right in front of your eyes? Because none of it feels real, Hugh said quietly. Because when I look at you at them, I feel nothing. No love, no recognition, no sense of belonging. But when I went to the bookshop this morning, when I sat in my office upstairs, everything felt right. Everything felt like home. "You have a head injury," Caroline said, her voice rising slightly. "Your perceptions are damaged. You can't trust what you feel right now. Then I'll have to trust what I can verify," Hugh said, standing to face her. "Tomorrow, I'm going back to the bookshop. I'm going to examine that apartment above it, and I'm going to find out what really happened to me." Caroline stared at him for a long moment, her green eyes reflecting emotions he couldn't identify. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. "If that's what you need to do to put your mind at ease, then of course you should do it. But when you find that the apartment is empty, when you realize that your suspicions are just the product of a damaged mind, I hope you'll be willing to accept help. Real help." She left the room without another word, her footsteps sharp against the hardwood floors. Hugh remained in the living room, staring at the family photographs that line the mantelpiece, wondering if any of them were real or if they were all carefully constructed lies designed to trap him in a life that had never been his. That night, Hugh lay in the guest room bed, listening to the sounds of the house around him. He could hear Caroline moving about in what was presumably their bedroom, her footsteps occasionally crossing the floor above his head. The children's rooms were on the same floor, and he could hear the soft murmur of Carolyn checking on them, the gentle closing of doors, the settling of a household preparing for sleep. It should have been comforting, this evidence of domestic routine and parental care. Instead, it filled Hugh with a growing sense of claustrophobia, as if the walls of the house were slowly closing in around him. Sometime after midnight, he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his door. They paused directly outside his room, and Hugh held his breath, wondering if Caroline intended to enter. The doorknob turned slowly, almost silently, and Hugh closed his eyes, finding sleep through his closed lids. He sensed light from the hallway spilling into his room. Someone was standing in the doorway, watching him. The presence lingered for what felt like several minutes before the door closed again and the footsteps retreated. Hugh lay motionless until he was certain whoever had been watching was gone. Then he rose quietly and went to the window, peering out at the garden behind the house. The night was clear with enough moonlight to make out the general shapes of trees and flower beds. But something was different about the garden from what he had seen that morning. There, beneath the oak tree, where the children's swing hung, was a dark patch in the grass, rectangular and clearly defined. It looked, he thought, with a chill that had nothing to do with the night air, very much like a grave. He watched the garden for nearly an hour, but nothing moved except the occasional flutter of leaves in the breeze. Eventually, fatigue overcame his anxiety, and he returned to bed. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of earth and digging, of voices calling his name from beneath the ground, of hands reaching up through dark soil to pull him down into whatever lay buried beneath the perfect domestic facade of Caroline's garden. Morning came gray and humid, with the promise of rain in the heavy air. Hugh woke with the absolute conviction that he had to escape this house, had to return to whatever reality he had been living before the accident claimed his memory. The note's warning echoed in his mind. "They aren't yours. Don't let them tuck you in." Someone had risked everything to deliver that message, and Hugh was beginning to understand why. He dressed quietly and slipped out of the guest room before the rest of the household was awake. In the kitchen, he found Caroline's purse hanging on a hook by the back door. Inside, among the usual domestic detritus, was a set of keys that included several he didn't recognize, but one that looked familiar. The key to the bookshop. Hugh pocketed the key and slipped out the back door, crossing the garden where he had seen the suspicious patch of earth the night before. In daylight, it was less ominous, simply a section where the grass grew differently, perhaps marking an old flower bed or the site of a removed tree. But he made a mental note to examine it more closely if he ever returned to this house. The walk to the bookshop was longer than he remembered, and his ribs ached with each step. But the pain felt clean, honest, unlike the psychological discomfort that had plagued him since awakening in the hospital. Bertram had not yet arrived when Hugh reached the shop, which was perfect for his purposes. The key worked smoothly in the lock, and Hugh felt a surge of rightness as he entered the familiar space. This was his domain, his sanctuary, the one place in Natchez that felt authentically his own. He made his way directly to the staircase, behind the philosophy section, and climbed to his office. But this time, instead of stopping there, he continued up a second narrower staircase that led to what Bertram had called the apartment above the shop. The door at the top of the stairs was locked, but Hugh's key ring included what appeared to be the right key. His heart pounded as he turned it in the lock, not knowing what he might find beyond. The door opened to reveal small but comfortable living space that was unmistakably occupied and obviously his own. A narrow bed with rumpled sheets, a kitchenette with coffee cups in the sink, clothes hanging in a closet that recognized his taste and size. Books everywhere, of course, but not the valuable volumes from the shop below. These were reading copies, personal favorites, books that showed the wear of frequent handling. Hugh moved through the space like a sleepwalker, touching objects that felt familiar beneath his fingers. Here was his favorite coffee mug, chipped but cherished. Here were his reading glasses placed beside a book that lay open to a page he remembered reaching the night before his departure for Jackson. Here was evidence of the life he actually remembered living: solitary, scholarly, content in its simplicity. In the bedroom, he found a dresser whose drawers contained his clothes, his personal effects, his private papers. Among these was a lease agreement dated only 6 months earlier, proving that far from being sold years ago, this apartment was his current legal residence. But the most significant discovery was a shoebox hidden beneath the bed, containing documents that made Hugh's blood run cold. Inside were legal papers, a marriage certificate, birth certificates for 3 children, insurance policies, bank statements, all bearing his name and signature, all apparently authentic. But the dates were wrong. According to these documents, his marriage to Caroline had taken place not 12 years ago, but only 6 months previously. The birth certificates for the children were even more recent, some dated as little as 3 months in the past. Hugh sank onto the bed, his mind reeling. If these documents were authentic, then everything Caroline had told him was a lie. Their marriage, their children, their years of domestic happiness, all of it was fiction, an elaborate deception constructed in the mere months before his accident. But why? What could possibly motivate someone to create such an intricate false reality? And how had it been done? How do you produce children who not only exist, but who seem to have genuine memories of a father they could not possibly have known for more than a few months? A sound from downstairs interrupted his thoughts. The shop door opening. Footsteps on the wooden floor. Bertram arriving for work, most likely. But Hugh found himself suddenly paranoid about being discovered here. He replaced the documents in their hiding place and made his way quietly to the window that overlooked the alley behind the shop. The window opened easily, and Hugh saw that a fire escape provided access to the ground level. He could leave without encountering whoever had entered the shop below. But as he prepared to climb out onto the metal platform, he heard voices from the shop. Not just Bertram's familiar tones, but Caroline's voice as well, sharp with what sounded like anger or fear. Hugh pressed himself against the wall beside the window, straining to hear their conversation through the old building's floors and walls. Told you he was asking questions. Caroline's voice partially obscured by distance and intervening structure. Didn't think he would remember. Bertram's reply clearer because of his deeper voice. The apartment. If he finds, I should have been more careful. The documents too late now have to. The conversation continued, but Hugh could make out only fragments. What he could hear was enough to confirm his worst suspicions. Bertram and Caroline were conspirators in whatever deception had trapped him. The kindly old bookseller, who had seemed like his only genuine connection to his real life, was as false as everything else. Hill climbed carefully onto the fire escape, wincing as his injured ribs protested the movement. The metal structure was old but solid, and he made his way down to the alley without incident. But where could he go now? Caroline would be looking for him, and apparently Bertram was part of whatever conspiracy surrounded him. The entire town of Natchez suddenly felt like hostile territory. He walked aimlessly through the historic district, trying to process what he had discovered. The documents in his apartment proved that his marriage to Caroline was recent, not the 12-year relationship she claimed. But the children remained a mystery. How do you create 3 children with distinct personalities, complete with memories and mannerisms that suggested years of development? Were they actors, victims of some other deception, or was there an explanation even more sinister than Hugh dared to contemplate? The morning had grown warmer, and Hugh's ribs ached from his activities. He found himself on a bench overlooking the Mississippi River, watching the muddy water flow past with the same indifferent persistence it had maintained for millennia. The river had witnessed countless human dramas, countless deceptions and revelations, and it would continue to flow long after Hugh's current crisis was resolved one way or another. It was there, sitting by the river, that the final piece of the puzzle came to him, not in a flash of revelation, but as a slow, creeping certainty that made his skin crawl with its implications. The children were real. They existed. They had memories. They genuinely seemed to care for the man they called Daddy. But they weren't his children. They belonged to someone else. The real Hugh Farrington, the man whose life had been stolen and given to an imposter. Hugh rose from the bench with movements that felt mechanical, robotic. If his theory was correct, then somewhere in Natchez was a man who looked like him, sounded like him, perhaps even shared his memories in some impossible way. And that man, the real Hugh Farrington, was missing his family, wondering where his children were, searching for the life that had been taken from him. The question was, where would such a man be? Where would you hide someone whose existence contradicted the elaborate deception you had constructed? The answer came to him with horrifying clarity. You would put him exactly where everyone expected him to be, in plain sight, but in a place where his protests would be dismissed as the ravings of a madman or the confusion of a brain-injured patient. He would put him in a hospital, but not the hospital where Hugh had awakened. That would be too obvious, too easy to discover. He would use a different facility, somewhere his claims about his identity would be treated as delusions rather than facts. Hugh began walking with purpose, now heading toward the older section of Natchez, where the state mental hospital had operated for over a century. If his theory was correct, if there really was another Hugh Finkton somewhere in the system, that's where he would be found. The Natchez State Hospital was a sprawling complex of brick buildings that spoke of decades of institutional care and institutional neglect. Hugh had driven past it countless times, but had never had reason to visit. Now, standing before its imposing gates, he felt the weight of possibility and dread in equal measure. Getting inside would be difficult without proper authorization. But Hugh had one advantage. He was, according to all official records, a recent patient himself. Hospital staff might be sympathetic to someone who claimed to be visiting a fellow patient, especially someone who showed obvious signs of recent medical treatment. The main entrance was monitored by security, but Hugh noticed that staff members were entering through a side door using key cards. He positioned himself near this entrance and waited for an opportunity. It came when a young woman in scrubs approached the door while juggling a coffee cup and an armload of files. Hugh stepped forward with a helpful smile. "Let me get that door for you," he said, reaching for the handle as she swiped her card. "Oh, thank you," she said gratefully, allowing him to hold the door as she maneuvered her burden through the opening. Hugh followed her inside, moving with the confident stride of someone who belonged. The interior of the hospital was institutional in the way of all such facilities. Fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors, the smell of disinfectant barely masking more organic odors. Finding the right patient would be challenging, but Hugh had an advantage. He knew exactly what he was looking for. Somewhere in this facility was a man who looked like him, who claimed to be Hugh Finkton of Commerce Street, who insisted that his wife and children had been stolen from him. The psychiatric ward was on the third floor. According to the directory in the main lobby, Hugh took the elevator up, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and fear. If he was wrong about this, if there was no other Hugh of Farrington, then he truly was suffering from delusions brought on by his head injury. But if he was right, the third floor was quieter than the rest of the hospital with a different quality of sound. Muffled conversations, distant crying, the soft shuffling of medicated footsteps. Hugh approached the nurse's station with as much confidence as he could muster. "I'm looking for a patient," he told the nurse on duty, a tired-looking woman with graying hair. Hugh Farrington. He was admitted recently, possibly under unusual circumstances. The nurse consulted her computer, frowning slightly. "Are you family?" In a manner of speaking, Hugh said, which was true enough. "Room 312, the nurse said, "but he's been quite agitated lately. Claims people have stolen his identity, kidnapped his family. Sad case. Complete break with reality following some kind of trauma." Room 312 was at the end of a long corridor lined with similar doors. Through the small window in each, Hugh could glimpse the residents of this floor. Some sleeping, some staring at television screens, some engaged in conversations with invisible companions. But the man in room 312 was none of these things. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the wall with an expression of profound loss that Hugh recognized because he had seen it in his own mirror. The man looked exactly like Hugh Farrington. Not similar, not reminiscent. Exactly the same down to the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident. Hugh distinctly remembered having the same gray eyes, the same slightly crooked nose, the same pattern of lines around the eyes that came from years of squinting at small print in old books. Hugh stood in the doorway, staring at his own face, his own body, his own self sitting lost and broken in a psychiatric hospital room. The other Hugh looked up, and their eyes met across the small space. For a moment, neither moved. Then the other Hugh rose slowly, his expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and something that might have been recognition. "You," he said quietly. "You're me." "Yes," Hugh replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then you know," the other Hugh said. "You know what they've done." Hugh stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Tell me," he said. "The other Hugh, the real Hugh." Hugh realized with growing certainty, sat back down heavily on the bed. His movements were those of a man who had been broken by circumstances beyond his comprehension. "They took everything." "Real," Hugh said, his voice hollow. "My wife, my children, my life. One day I woke up here and they told me I was delusional, that I was imagining a family that didn't exist. But I know what's real. I know what I've lost. Caroline, you said Christopher, Penelope, Edmund." The real Hugh's eyes filled with tears. "You've seen them. You've been with them. Are they all right? Are they safe?" Hugh felt a crushing weight settle on his chest. This man, this broken mirror image of himself, genuinely loved the family that Hugh had felt nothing for. The children who had seemed like strangers to Hugh were this man's beloved offspring. and he had been torn away from them by forces neither of them yet understood. "They're safe," Hugh said gently, "but they don't remember you. They think I'm their father." "Of course they do," the real you said bitterly. "That's how it works. That's how she makes it work. She Caroline, though I don't think that's her real name. Nothing about her is real. Nothing about any of this is real." Hugh sat in the room's single chair, studying this man who shared his face, but carried wounds that Hugh couldn't remember receiving. "How long have you been here?" 3 months, they tell me, though time moves strangely in this place. Sometimes it feels like years, sometimes like days. They give me medications that make everything fuzzy, make it hard to think clearly. But I remember being happy. "Tell me about your life," Hugh said. "Your real life." The real Hugh's expression softened as he spoke of mornings with his children, of helping Christopher with his homework, of Penelope's recorder recital, of Edmund's endless questions about everything. He described a marriage that had grown deeper over 12 years, a house that was truly a home, quiet Sunday mornings, reading while Caroline garden-arted. "We were ordinary," he said, "wonderfully, perfectly ordinary. I had my bookshop. Caroline had her painting. She's quite talented, you know. And the children had their small dramas and triumphs. It wasn't exciting, but it was ours. What's the last thing you remember before ending up here?" "I was driving back from Jackson. I'd found a first edition Poe that I'd been searching for. I was thinking about how pleased Caroline would be. She understood what books meant to me, even if she didn't share the obsession. And then nothing. I woke up here and they told me I was Hugh Farrington, but that everything I remembered was a fantasy." Hugh felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying clarity. "The accident," he said. "There really was an accident. Yes, but not the kind they told you about. I think someone arranged it. Someone who needed both of us out of the way temporarily. Both of us." The real Hugh looked directly at him with eyes that held a terrible knowledge. "You're not just someone who looks like me. You are me. You're Hugh Farrington just as much as I am. We're the same person. Somehow split, copied, duplicated." The words should have sounded insane, but Hugh found himself accepting them with the calm that comes when impossible things suddenly make perfect sense. It explained everything. Why he remembered the bookshop, but not the family. Why the family felt like strangers despite overwhelming evidence of their relationship. Why there had been 2 sets of documents in his apartment. How is that possible? I don't know. The real you admitted, but I know it's true. I can see it in your face. You remember the bookshop, the apartment above it, the life of a solitary man. But you don't remember Caroline or the children because you never lived with them. You're the part of me that was left behind, the part that didn't get to have that happiness. Hugh thought about this, about the implications of being only a fragment of a person, a shadow cast by someone else's life. It should have been devastating, but instead, he felt an odd sense of relief. It explained why he had felt so disconnected from everything, why love for his supposed family had been impossible to summon. "What does Caroline want?" he asked. "What's the purpose of all this?" I think the real Hugh said slowly, "She wants to keep what she's taken. the house, the children, the life we built together. But she needed me out of the way to do it, and she needed someone to take my place who wouldn't ask too many questions. But I am asking questions. Yes. And that's what she didn't expect. She thought your memories would return gradually, that you'd slip back into the role without realizing what had been done. But you're not me. Not really. You're the part of me that lived alone, that was comfortable with solitude. You don't have the capacity to love them the way they need to be loved. Hugh considered this. The note in the hospital, was that from you? No. I've been locked up here since before your accident. But there must be someone else who knows what's happening. Someone who's trying to help. Bertram. Maybe. Though I overheard him talking to Caroline this morning. Bertram. The real Hugh's face grew troubled. I trusted him completely. If he's part of this, maybe he's being coerced. Maybe they have something on him. A sound in the corridor outside made both men freeze. Footsteps coming closer, accompanied by voices Hugh recognized with a chill of fear. Room 312. Caroline's voice sharp with anxiety. He has to be here. Where else would he go? Mrs. Farrington. A man's voice. Probably a doctor. I must insist that you not agitate the patient. He's made remarkable progress recently. And we don't want to trigger another episode. You don't understand, Caroline said. The man you think is my husband. He's not. He's somehow connected to your patient here. And if they meet, the door handle turned, and Hugh realized he had nowhere to hide in the small room. He looked at the real Hugh, who had gone pale, but whose eyes held a desperate determination. Whatever happened, the real Hugh whispered, "Remember that they're my children. Remember that I love them." The door opened and Caroline stepped inside, followed by a middle-aged man in a white coat. She saw Hugh immediately, and her face went through a series of rapid changes. Surprise, fear, and something that might have been triumph. "There you are," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Who, darling? You've had us so worried when you didn't come home." "Home," he repeated, looking from Caroline to the broken man on the bed. "Which one of us are you talking to?" The doctor stepped forward, his expression professionally concerned. "Sir, I'm Dr. Whitfield. I think there's been some confusion. This patient has been suffering from severe delusions, and I'm afraid your presence here might exacerbate his condition." "My presence," Hugh said, "or his?" He gestured to the real Hugh, who was staring at Caroline with an expression of such longing and pain that Hugh felt his heart contract in sympathy. "Caroline," the real you whispered, "please, I know you remember. I know some part of you remembers how happy we were." Caroline's composure wavered for just a moment, and he who saw something flicker across her face. Regret, perhaps, or the ghost of genuine affection. But it was gone almost immediately, replaced by the careful mask she had worn since Hugh's awakening in the hospital. "I'm sorry," she said to the real you, her voice gentle but firm. "I don't know what you think you remember, but I've never seen you before in my life. My husband is right here." She moved to Hugh's side, taking his arm in a gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. "Your husband!" Hugh said, pulling away from her grip, is sitting on that bed, and you know it. Dr. Whitfield cleared his throat. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in my office. This is clearly a complex situation that requires careful handling. But Hugh was no longer interested in careful handling or professional mediation. The sight of the real Hugh's anguish, the obvious love he felt for a family that had been stolen from him, filled Hugh with a rage he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. "How did you do it?" he demanded, turning to face Caroline. "How did you split us? How did you create two people from one?" "Who? You're not making sense," Caroline said. But there was panic beneath her calm exterior. "Now you're confused, disoriented. We need to get you back to Dr. Peton, get you proper care. I found the documents. You said in my apartment above the bookshop. The apartment you claimed was sold years ago. Marriage certificate dated 6 months ago. Birth certificates for the children that are even more recent. Everything you told me was a lie. The real you looked up sharply. The children's birth certificates are recent. Very recent. Some of them only a few months old." Understanding dawned in the real Hugh's eyes, followed by horror, so profound that you felt it like a physical blow. "They're not birth certificates." The real Hugh said slowly, "They're adoption papers. She didn't steal my children. She stole me, and then she stole children to replace the ones I remember." The room fell silent except for the institutional hum of fluorescent lights and distant hospital sounds. Caroline's face had gone pale, and Dr. Whitfield was looking between the two men with growing alarm. "That's impossible," Caroline said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Hugh asked. "Is it any more impossible than creating two identical men from one? Is it any more impossible than making a whole town believe that I've been married for 12 years when I've been living alone above my bookshop? The children," the real Hugh said, his voice breaking. "My real children. What happened to my real children?" Carolyn's silence was answer enough. Hugh felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach as he realized the full scope of what had been done. Not just identity theft, but something far more sinister. The complete erasure of a family. The replacement of real people with carefully chosen substitutes. "Where are they?" Hugh demanded. "Where are his real wife and children?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Carolyn said, but she was backing toward the door now, her composure finally cracking completely. Dr. Whitfield stepped forward, clearly out of his depth, but trying to maintain some semblance of professional control. "I think we need to involve hospital security. This situation is becoming potentially dangerous." But Hugh was already moving not toward Caroline, but toward the real Hugh who had risen from the bed with sudden purpose. "We have to find them," the real Hugh said. "If the children I've been living with are substitutes, then my real family is somewhere else. Somewhere she's hidden them, or somewhere they've been." Hugh couldn't finish the thought, couldn't voice the possibility that was growing stronger in his mind. Carolyn had reached the door now, but instead of fleeing, she turned back. Something had changed in her face. The careful mask of whiffly concern had slipped away entirely, revealing the exhausted desperation of someone who had been carrying an unbearable secret. "You want to know the truth?" she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Fine, but you won't like it." She stepped back into the room, and Dr. Whitfield started to protest, but something in her manner made him fall silent. Hugh noticed her hands were trembling, not with fear, but with the kind of fatigue that comes from months of impossible strain. "I was a neurobiologist," Caroline said quietly, "at the university, before everything fell apart. I specialized in memory mapping, consciousness transfer, theoretical work mostly, the kind of research that gets you laughed out of conferences." Hugh felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What does that have to do with you?" "Everything." Caroline's laugh was bitter. Hugh Farrington was brilliant, kind, the sort of man who deserved to live longer than 37 years. When the accident happened, when I lost him, I couldn't accept it. I had his brain scans from a research study he'd participated in. Detailed maps of every neural pathway, every memory engram. The other Hugh was staring at her with growing horror. "That's impossible. You can't just recreate a person from brain scans. Not perfectly, no. But you can create approximations, fragments. The technology exists. Experimental, dangerous, completely illegal. I knew people who had access to the right equipment, people who owed me favors." Dr. Whitfield found his voice. "You're talking about cloning. Human cloning is not cloning. Something worse." Caroline wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I grew 2 bodies using Hugh's genetic material. Rapid aging accelerated development. Then I uploaded fragments of his consciousness, different pieces, different aspects of his personality. One got his love of solitude, his scholarly nature. The other got his capacity for family, for domestic happiness." Hugh felt the world tilting around him. "We were copies, failed copies, incomplete ones. The process is imperfect. That's why you have gaps. Why? Nothing feels quite right. You're not him. You're shadows of him pieced together from neural fragments and wishful thinking." Carolyn's voice broke slightly. "Bertram helped me at first. He loved you too. Couldn't bear to see everything end. But when he realized what I was really doing, what you really were, he tried to stop me. The note in the hospital was his doing. A desperate attempt to warn you before it was too late. But the memories," the other Hugh whispered. "I remember my children being born. I remember falling in love with you, implanted, constructed from his brain scans and my own desperate fantasies about the life we might have had. I gave you false memories to try to make you whole, to make you happy." Caroline's voice cracked. "I thought if I could just perfect the process, if I could make you believe you were real. The children, you said they're real orphans. I volunteer at the children's home. That's how I met them. They needed a family. And I thought I could give them the father they deserved, even if he wasn't quite real." Hugh looked at his hands, flesh and blood certainly, but grown in some laboratory animated by stolen memories and artificial neural patterns. Everything he thought he was had been constructed by a grieving woman who couldn't let go. "How long do we have?" he asked quietly. Caroline's face crumpled. "The neural patterns are degrading. The implanted memories are breaking down, fragmenting. I estimate maybe weeks, possibly days. That's why you're starting to remember things that don't fit. Why you're questioning everything. The artificial consciousness is failing. The other you was weeping now, silent tears streaming down a face that looked exactly like Hugh's own. I love them so much, he whispered. Even if it's artificial, even if it's not real, I love those children. I know. Caroline said that's the krillest part. The love is real, even if everything else is constructed. Your capacity to feel, to care, that came from him. That was the one thing I managed to preserve perfectly. Hugh felt a strange sense of peace settling over him. The mystery was solved, the questions answered. He wasn't Hugh Finkton, but he carried pieces of that man's heart, his capacity for love and wonder. That had to count for something. What happens to the children when we're gone? He asked. They'll be adopted properly by people who can give them real lives, not fantasies built on grief and impossible science. Caroline looked between them with profound regret. I'm so sorry. I thought I could make it work. I thought love was enough. The other Hughes stood up slowly, his movements careful, deliberate. Caroline, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Tell them we love them. When they're old enough to understand what happened, tell them that even though we weren't real, our love for them was. Tell them we wanted to be real for them. Caroline nodded, unable to speak. Hugh felt the artificial neural patterns beginning to destabilize, memories fragmenting like old film burning. But the love remained clear, bright, untouchable. Perhaps that was the only real thing about him. His capacity to care for 3 children who had needed a father, even a temporary one. Take care of them, he said to Carolyn. All of them. Give them the life we couldn't. The degradation was accelerating now. Consciousness unraveling like a badly knitted sweater. But you found he wasn't afraid. He had existed, however briefly, however artificially. He had loved and been loved in return for a creation of science and grief. Perhaps that was enough. Dr. Whitfield stood frozen, watching something unprecedented unfold before him. 2 men who weren't quite men, saying goodbye to a life they'd never quite lived. Caroline watched through her tears as the neural patterns finally collapsed as 2 impossible consciousnesses released their hold on existence and faded into whatever silence waits for artificial dreams when they finally end. The room fell quiet. Outside, the Mississippi River continued its ancient flow, carrying away the remnants of one story while preparing to witness countless others. In the distance, a bookshop stood empty waiting, and that brings us to the end of another night filled with tales from the shadows. To anyone who stuck with me until the very end, thank you so much for sharing this journey into the unknown. Your company makes these dark stories feel a little less lonely, and I'm truly grateful you chose to spend your evening here with me. I hope these tales have given you exactly what you came for, that delicious blend of fear and fascination. There's something wonderfully eerie about how we can all gather in the darkness, connected by our love of a good scare. And I genuinely hope tonight's stories resonated with you as much as they did with me. I'll be back tomorrow night with more mysteries and chills waiting to unfold. So, I hope you'll join me again. Until then, sleep well, dream peacefully, and don't let tonight's stories follow you into your dreams. Though if they do, just remember they're only stories after all. Sweet dreams, my friend. See you tomorrow night. Heat, heat,